Hello everybody, and welcome back to more Diablo 3. This time we're going to be doing a Demon Hunter guide, and that's because Demon Hunters as of 2.4.1, or, also Season 6, are in a really good spot with their builds, and that's likely to not change unless they drastically alter the sets. So they have two sets that are really good at the moment, which are Marauders, which is the one we're going to be doing in this video. They have the Unhallowed Essence, which also, again, is very, very good and can push just as hard as Marauders. And then there's the Litany of the Undaunted and Wailing Host build, which is the no-set set. All three of those are really, really good. Some of them, like the Litany one, can get much higher and greater rifts than the others. But as just a basic, starter build, this is actually fairly good, this Marauders build. So let's kind of get into it. We're going to talk about the gear in great detail and the skill builds, and also how to play it properly. Also through the lens of hardcore. So if you play hardcore out there, that will really help, because that's what I've been playing this season, which has really helped me understand this build quite a bit. So let's hop into the gear so we can kind of understand what's happening. So first and foremost, you're going to be using the Marauder set, all 6 pieces. The 2 set bonus is companion calls all companions to your side, which is, we'll go over that in the skills, but basically you have all these pets with you that do different things. The 4 set bonus is sentries, which are the little turrets you can throw down, deal 400% increased damage, and cast elemental arrow, chakram, impale, multi-shot, and cluster arrow when you do. That's really, really good. And then your 6th set is your primary skills, which is anything that generates hatred. Then elemental arrow, chakram, impale, multi-shot, cluster arrow, companions, and vengeance all deal 800% increased damage for every active sentry that you have. And while you're playing, you'll see a little buff on your buff bar that will show the sentry and then the number of them that you have. And that's really important to kind of keep track of, especially because that resets when you switch levels in a Greater Rift or a Rift. And we'll talk about that as we go over the playstyle. Now, obviously, you want all 6 pieces, right? So what do you want on those 6 pieces? That is, the shoulders, let's start with that. You're going to want dexterity, obviously, vitality, and cooldown reduction. So those are like base, like that. Those are what you want. And then if you can get it, you want sentry damage. So sentry damage, it's minor, but it is going to make a pretty big difference in your overall damage output over time. So that's pretty important to get on there. The helmet, you want dexterity, vitality, and crit chance. But if you're not playing hardcore, then try to get the vitality off there and get cluster arrow damage. That will be really, really good. Then on the chest piece, you of course want dexterity, vitality, and make sure you have 3 sockets. And after that, just try to go for more survivability. For the pants, you're going to want dexterity, vitality, and then really anything. You could do armor, life regen, you could do evasive fire damage, because you'll be using evasive fire if you really want it. Personally, I would probably roll mine off to armor. I just haven't rolled it yet. With the gloves, you want dexterity, vitality, and then mostly the vitality on hardcore. But if you're not playing hardcore, just do dexterity, critical hit damage, critical hit chance, and cooldown reduction. You do want that cooldown reduction. It's very, very good for this build. But if you're, struggling with surviving, get the cooldown reduction off there and get vitality on. Now, finally, for the boots, you want dexterity, vitality, then whatever, it doesn't matter what else is on there, as long as you have cluster arrow damage. Try to get that to 15% if you can. It will make a big difference. And to go hand in hand with Marauders, you want Zoe's Secret, which is a belt, and the active on it is that you take up to 9% less damage for every companion that you have active. Now, this means like your spider, your boar, and your wolf, and also your ferret, obviously. But the thing with it is this stacks with another item that will have an RQ blader. It's just so good. For this build, it's a must-have. You can't use any other belt. You got to use this belt. It will keep you alive. In the vein of keeping you alive, you want Wraps of Clarity, which are bracers. They will make it so your hatred generators reduce your damage taken for 5 seconds. And this is something that you're going to be using anyways, your hatred generators. So Ideally on stats for that, you want physical damage, 20%, dexterity, vitality, and critical hit chance. With the belt, you just want pretty much all survivability that you can get out of the belt. So make sure you have dexterity and then vitality, life, and armor. Potentially, you can get life regen. And then for the weapon, you want Manticore. This is just a must-have for this build in order to get it to work properly. So with Manticore, you're getting cluster arrow damage by default, which is really, really good. Don't roll that off. You want dexterity and vitality if you can get it, and percent damage. And obviously, you want to use one of the gifts, the Ramalandi's gifts, which will put a socket on the weapon without you having to roll it. They're fairly rare, but if you can get one, make sure you use it on an ancient version of this. A good one, a good ancient version. But the actual thing about this that makes it really good is that it reduces the hatred cost of Cluster Arrow by up to 50%. And Cluster Arrow is a very hatred spending attack. It's going to pretty much drain all of your hatred in just a few shots. So you want this weapon in order to spam your Cluster Arrow. And then also to go along with that, to increase your damage, you want Bombardier's Rucksack, the quiver, which will allow you to have 2 additional sentries, which, as we know, stacks with the Marauders set. So it gives you 800% increased damage for every active sentry you have. And with Bombardier's Rucksack and with a passive, we can get up to 5 sentries. So 5 times 8, you can do the math. It's really, really good. You want this, and you really can't go without it if you want to push high greater rifts. There's a lot of different really good rolls that you can have on the Bombardier's Rucksack. Generally speaking, make sure you have the attack speed and the critical hit chance on there, and then everything else you can kind of screw around with. For rings, you want focus and restraint. So what this does is when you hit with a resource generating attack, it increases your damage by 50% for 5 seconds. And when you hit with a resource spending attack, it increases your damage by 50% for 5 seconds. So you're getting this really huge just damage boost by just using your hatred generating and hatred spending attacks. And these can both be active at the same time, so you want to keep them active at all times. With the rolls on it, honestly, you could probably on softcore get away without having any dexterity on there and just have critical hit chance, critical hit damage, obviously a socket, and then potentially cooldown reduction if you can get it, or rolling around with dexterity if you can get it on there, because that's a big damage increase. But generally speaking, you want both the focus and the restraint with at least either critical hit chance or critical hit damage at the very least. If you get a really good one, it'll have both on it. With the necklace, you actually want to craft a Hellfire amulet, and you get these by doing the key wardens. You get the machines, and then the machines in Act 1, you go to Tristram and you can open them up in the little secret house. You should know how to do this if you've been playing Diablo. You use the machines to open up the portals to go kill the Uber bosses, which drop the required materials. You get the pattern from Squirt in Act 2 in order to make the amulet to begin with. But what the amulet does is it gives you a passive on it. So one of your passive skills for your class. There's a lot of different passive skills that you can have on this, and we'll go over them when we go over the skills, but just make sure that you get a really good one. You want an ancient one with dexterity and critical hit damage and critical hit chance, but if you're playing softcore, you can get away with not having any of the dexterity and just having 20% physical damage, critical hit chance, critical hit damage, and then the socket always rolls on it, so you don't have to worry about that. So as far as skills are concerned, they're all pretty set in stone, but there are a few that can switch out depending on what you have or what you want to do. So generally speaking, the primary, the generator, is evasive fire focus. This doesn't change much at all. This is just a really, really good rune, and it generates 7 hatred, has a good spread. You'll be casting this ability once every 5 seconds to keep your focus and restraint up, but will also keep your damage reduction up from your bracers. So this won't change much unless you happen to not be using Cluster Arrow. You can switch it out for multi-shot instead, for more of a farming build with Marauders. And you could be using, since you're not using Cluster Arrow, you could use either Yang's recurve for the multi-shot attack speed, Or additionally, you can actually switch out for a Creator Shot, which will have your Elemental Arrow generate hatred. So you can actually switch Evasive Fire out for Elemental Arrow. Specifically, the cold one is really, really good, and you can use that as a generator for more of a farming stuff. But for Greater Rifts, you want Evasive Fire Focus, and you want Manticore to be reduced in the cost of your Cluster Arrow. Speaking of Cluster Arrow, there's actually a few really good runes, but the one we're using is just really the best for pushing Greater Rifts, which is the Shooting Stars rune. It will shoot 2 rockets after its explosion. That will do 600% weapon damage, which is just under the damage that the explosion does itself. This is really, really, really good. Alternatively, if you don't have physical damage and you want to go maybe with more of a clearing build where you're doing T10 instead of Greater Rifts, you could switch out for Maelstrom, which is a cold rune, but it shoots an additional rocket and it gives you some life per hit back. This is actually pretty good for Greater Rifts as well. It's just harder to get the output necessary on any big group of mobs necessarily because of the additional damage that the Shooting Stars does compared to the 450% that the Maelstrom does. It's really good, but it does shoot an additional rocket, so it's not bad. It is an alternative if you can't quite get physical damage, if you just happen to get like a good 20% cold. Try both of them out. They're both very, very good. If you really want to go crazy, Loaded for Bear, which is the fire one, it doesn't have any rockets that shoot out, but it does do 850% fire damage at its explosion. So if you're really good at aiming them, you can single target down something really quickly with that rune. It's super good, but generally speaking, you'll be using Shooting Stars. For your number 1 ability or wherever you want to put it on your bar, use Vengeance, and there's a couple different things that we could do with our cube to make this really good, but generally we will keep Seethe, which is 10 hatred per second, because as we know, Cluster Arrow sucks up all your hatred, so having Seethe will make sure that doesn't happen. You'll have pretty much all the hatred that you need using Seethe, but if you're having a huge issue staying alive, switch to Dark Heart, which reduces all damage taken by 50%. For our pretty much movement and ability to get away and in and out of combat, we want to use Vault with the Tumble rune. This is pretty standard. There's nothing too crazy here, but you could switch Vault out if you aren't playing hardcore. I would say Vault is necessary for hardcore because there's times where you will just get wrecked if you cannot vault out of things. But if you're playing softcore and you want to go crazy, you could switch it out for like Mark for Death if you really want to, or maybe, I don't know, anything else that you want to, but Vault is really good. Then there's the necessary Sentry. There are 2 runes here that you can use. I use Polar Station because that will activate our passive and one of our gems. I'll get to the gems in a second, the passives in a second, but it slows them. So that is generally pretty good, but you have to have the Sentry on top of them to really do the huge slow. This is something that you'll be doing anyways, so it's not out of the ordinary. But the optional one is Guardian Turret, which will give anyone who's nearby it, there'll be like a little bubble around the Sentry, 25% reduced damage taken. That's actually pretty big, and it could make a pretty big difference in your rifts if that's something that you're able to use. So be mindful of what your skills are. If you need the slow to proc your passive and your gems, then use Polar Station. If you need the survivability, just use Guardian Turret. It's really, really good. Then for your companion, just use Wolf. But generally speaking, because you're using Marauders, you'll have all of them out there. So what do all of them do? This is actually pretty important. Your spiders, they will pretty much throw webs down when you activate, and the webs will slow things, which will activate your passive and your gem, so you get the damage bonus out of Bane of the Trapped that way. Then your Bat Companion will just regenerate hatred, and when you activate the active on Companion, it will give you 50 hatred. This is so good. This is insanely good for just bursting down targets. Boar Companion will, when you activate it, will charge you and taunt everything around you, which is pretty good, but then it also gives you life regeneration and 20% resistance to all elements, so that's good for survivability. Your ferret is the least important one out of all of this. It will pick up gold, but your pets that you have already, your cosmetic pets, will do that for you. But it does increase, gold found by 10%, and it does increase your movement speed by 10%, but generally speaking, it's not that great. Wolf Companion, though, is the best one out of all of these, which is when you use it, the activated ability will increase damage by 30% for 10 seconds. And this will stack with one of the items we have in the cube. I'll tell you about that in a moment, but this is amazing. This is so good to have. This will be when you want to burst something down, you kind of unload all your hatred, then you companion to get your hatred back, and then you also have the 30% increased damage. It's stupid good. I'll talk about how to use that stuff when we go over the gameplay style, but those are your general active abilities that you want. These don't change much. They're just, like I said, they're pretty set in stone, but they're really good. Now let's talk passives real quick. Generally, again, for this build, you want Awareness, Ballistics, Custom Engineering, and Call of the Week. Awareness will keep you alive. It's a save from death. Depending on whether or not you're playing hardcore, you either have to have this or it's not necessary. But if you're playing softcore, Awareness is just good to have anyways, because it will make sure that you don't just get insta-killed by stupid stuff, especially when you're pushing high-grade rifts. In hardcore, it's a necessary thing to have just in general. You can't get rid of it. Ballistics will increase the damage of the rockets that your cluster arrow does by 100%, which is really good, and then you also have a chance to shoot off a rocket, which is okay, but the rocket damage on cluster arrow will be really good here. So ballistics, you can change this out for other things, but it's stupid good for cluster arrow. For custom engineering, it will increase the number of sentries you can have by 1, and it'll increase the damage they do as well. But this, in combination with the Bombardier's Rucksack, will make it sure that you can have 5 sentries out at a time, which is a huge damage boost. You can't get rid of this. An optional one, but is one that is still really good, is Call of the Week, which is 20% increased damage on slowed targets. So this goes hand in hand with the Polar Station, which is nice. If you're using the cold arrow, or the cold cluster arrow, that can slow as well, so that could proc this instead of having to use Polar Station. I've tested that out. It does work, but it's interesting how you have to flip that around. Now, because we're using Hellfire Amulet, or we want to use Hellfire Amulet, I just haven't gotten a good one on my build yet for hardcore this season, you can actually get so many good passives. The Demon Hunter has a ton of passives that they can use for this build, and the ones that you could use if you get it on the amulet, or if you get any of the ones that you have active at the moment on the amulet, then you could switch one of them out for any of these. You could get Thrill of the Hunt, which means your hatred spenders slow targets by 80%. This means you wouldn't have to run the Polar Station, and you can run Guardian Turret. You could use Blood Vengeance, and instead of using Seethe on Vengeance, you could use the Dark Heart, which will reduce your damage taken. And then basically your Blood Vengeance is, keeping up with the hatred you need. It's not going to be as good, but it is still really, really good. Steady Aim increases your damage by 20% if there's no targets within 10 yards, which is actually a pretty small range around your character. But Steady Aim is really good because it goes hand in hand with your Stone of Vengeance, which is a gem. And it's just a big damage increase. It's good. If you can get used to the playstyle of, always keeping things at range, it will be hand over hand just as good as Call of the Week, because you can generally keep Steady Aim up more than you can a slow. It's good. Then there's also Numbing Traps. This isn't as good, but it is still pretty good, where you reduce the damage taken, or reduce the damage that enemies are doing, which in turn reduces your damage taken. In the same vein, Perfectionist kind of does the same thing, reduces discipline cost, so you can vault a lot more, but increases your armor and your resistance to all damage types by 10%. It's really good. It is a very good passive, especially for hardcore characters. There's Leech, which increases your life per hit. Again, very good. And then Ambush, which is probably more of the preferred one out of all of those, which you deal 40% increased damage to enemies above 75% health. This is good just for bursting things down, but is generally accepted as a really, really good passive. So any of those will work for being on your amulet or being as a passive slot if you get any of the standard ones on your Hellfire amulet. So now let's switch over to the cube. So in Kanai's cube, you want Dawn as your weapon. This is non-negotiable. It's just stupid good. Reduces the cooldown of Vengeance by 65%. Vengeance, as we know, will keep your hatred up, but if you're using Darkheart, it will keep your damage reduction up. But if you're just using it for the hatred, then generally speaking, what this will do is it'll keep you alive in weird ways that you wouldn't expect. Because Vengeance allows you to not be vortexed, because it reduces like all of the movement impairing kind of things. So you won't be vortexed, you won't be jailered, which are really nice for a demon hunter to be able to completely avoid. You also won't be knocked back if you get hit by knockback, and it's stupid good. You have to have Dawn in your weapon, because having almost permanent Vengeance up is just so good. For the armor piece, there's two that you can use. I like the Cloak of the Garwolf. This gives you 3 wolves, which also do, by the way, have the multiplicative effect of 30% each. So when I use mine, for example, my damage just by itself on my character at the moment, with the gear that I've shown you, has 1.3, almost 1.4 million damage. When I use Companion, it just would exponentially go through the roof, because it's 30% on each of the 3 wolves. It's so good. Also, it gives that to your party members as well. So if you're playing with other people, having the 3 additional wolves is stupid good. Plus, that goes in hand with Zoe's Secret. If you don't have that on, you lose so much toughness, because having the additional basically 10 or almost 20% damage reduction coming from the 2 additional wolves is just, it's good. It's really good. If you don't have this, you can use the Visage of Goons or Guns or however it's pronounced, which is Vengeance gains the effect of the Darkheart rune. So you can have both Seethe and Darkheart. It's an option, but generally speaking, having the additional wolves is just going to be better in my experience. For the ring slot, Convention of Elements is stupid good. It's where most of our damage is going to come from, because when the 200% tips onto physical, that's when we kind of unleash everything that we have and we just blow things up. It's just good. There are a couple other options. Elusive Ring will be a good damage reduction if you need it, which is every time you cast Shadow Power, Smokescreen, or Vault, and Vault's going to be the one that procs it here, you take 60% reduced damage for 8 seconds. I mean, 60% reduced. It's really good. You would use that over Unity, for example, just because Unity is a 50% damage reduction, whereas this is 60. Yeah, you have to cast Vault to keep it up, but once you get used to it, it's really, really good. Other than that, if you really, really wanted to, you could use Ring of Royal Grandeur, which will allow you to equip a Cloak of the Garwolf instead of have it in your cube, and then also have your Visage in the cube to get the Darkheart rune, along with Seethe on Vengeance, which will give you a ton of damage reduction, although you'll be missing out on a lot of actual damage. So I would suggest Convention of Elements, but all of those are viable. Finally, before we get to the really cool stuff, just gems. Generally speaking, you want 3 of them. One of them is interchangeable, but the 3 are the Bane of the Trapped, which increases the damage dealt to things that are slowed. It also procs off itself, though you don't want to be within 15 yards of things, generally speaking. You'll proc it based on what we've talked about before. It's basically a better version of the Call of the Week, so it's really, really good. Then you want Zay's Stone of Vengeance, which increases the damage by a percentage for every 10 yards between you and the enemy, and there's a maximum at up to 50 yards. So it's just stupid good. It has a 20% chance to stun enemies for 1 second when you hit them. It's really, really good. I don't think you could go without that one. That one's not interchangeable at all, because you're going to be wanting to stay away from enemies anyways, and it does a good job of increasing your damage by a huge amount. The one that is interchangeable is Bane of the Powerful. They increased it in this last patch, so you can actually use it now, which is you gain 20% increased damage for a certain amount of time after killing an elite pack. Once it gets high enough rank, you can keep this up almost permanently, so it's basically just 20% increased damage, with the secondary effect of having an additional 15% increased damage versus elites, and you take 15% reduced damage from them as well. This is really good for hardcore, because it'll keep you alive a little bit better, and it'll increase your damage. There are a few options that you can do. I would say Bane of the Stricken is the most obvious one, because you're getting that extra damage on the Rift Guardian. So if you're having a problem killing Rift Guardians within the time limit, Bane of the Stricken is the one to go with. If you're having a problem dying a lot, you can go with either Molten Wildebeest Gizzard, which is the health regeneration one, or Esoteric Alteration, which is the non-physical damage reduction one, which is pretty good. So let's talk about how you actually play this build. Now, it's once again important to point out that I am playing on hardcore, so I'm playing differently than what I normally would on softcore. I'm playing super cautiously, but generally speaking, you're going to throw down your turrets on the enemies, because it slows them if you're using the cold rune. If you're using Guardian turret, you can throw it down on yourself, or close by to where you can be in it to get that damage reduction. And then you're going to gather enemies. You can do this in softcore. It's a little bit easier because you're not worried about killing your character off. You could vault into an area, aggro everything, and then bring them back to your turrets, which is really good. And then you just kill them there. But you want to do this in between your conventional elements. So your conventional elements, you'll know, is about to get to physical when you see the lightning one. And that's when you know, okay, get everything ready to just unload all of my hatred onto the targets, because it's going to blow them up. But if you're doing hardcore, you're not going to really be vaulting in to get everything as much. You can if you're feeling really confident in your ability to stay alive, but you'll be playing a little bit more back and out of the way of everything. So what will happen is you're going to gather everything, make sure your turrets are all down, and when you switch levels in a Greater Rift, the problem is that your buff from your sentries will go away, and you will need to place down your sentries again. So you have a little bit of ramp-up time as you get all 5 down again, and you can only have 3 charges of sentry at any given time, so there's always going to be ramp when you get into a new level. But you'll be using your sentries fairly often to kind of place them down to the point where they can actually attack things. You place them down, you get things in it, you blow them up. That's the general consensus. But you make sure that you always have your bracer buff up with your focus and restraint as well by casting Evasive Fire. And then you always make sure you have your focus and restraint buff up from casting Cluster Arrow, which you will anyways. This build can require a bit of micro and stutter stepping to kind of get away from things, whereas then you're attacking and moving and attacking and moving. And you can do this by binding your force attack, or force standstill rather, whatever you want to use it for. But you're gonna try to stay away from everything as much as possible. And the thing you're looking out for, this is the biggest pro tip I can give for this build, is you're watching for that convention of elements to hit physical. So as soon as it hits lightning, you're waiting, and then you hit your companion as soon as it hits physical, or in the middle of your physical proc, which will give you hatred back, but will also increase your damage by a stupid amount, on top of the 200%, which will be a multiplicative addition with your companions, your wolf companion. So you do that, and then you just pretty much hold right-click. You want to hit your Evasive Fire beforehand, and then you just unload all of your hatred onto the targets as soon as it's physical. If you can get really good at this rotation, you will blow up everything, and you can kill Rift Guardians stupid fast. That's generally speaking. If you're playing a hardcore for Rift Guardians, there are a few that are super dangerous that can do a lot of damage to you suddenly, but basically any of the ones that shoot a huge missile out or are able to do like a huge attack on you. You know, what comes to mind is like the Butcher. You can do the huge like fan of chains. If that hits you, it's going to do a ton of damage. You're going to want to be really careful with that. So if you can, make sure you save a conduit pylon, a channeling pylon. Channeling's less good for us with this build, or a shield pylon, ideally. And you want to save that for the Rift Guardian. So you save a few enemies around it as well, and you just skip it, especially if you know that you're really close. Like if you're 75 or 80% through the rift, then what you're going to do is you're going to save that pylon and you're going to move on, but you're going to leave the enemies there. And then once you're about to get the Rift Guardian, you go back, you kill the enemies, it spawns the Rift Guardian. Make sure that it's really close, though, on spawning it. And then you just go and you hit the pylon and you kill them with whatever pylon you had there. So that's the gameplay of it. It is pretty butt-clenching if you don't have the damage reduction, and if you're playing on hardcore, but if you're playing on softcore, just kind of get really aggressive, because you can do a lot of damage with this build. I would say if I had a huge amount of paragons, paragon levels, and if I had really high gem levels, and if I also had, like additional stats on all of my gear and really rolled gear, I could probably cap out to 85 or 90 on greater rifts with this build, which is really, really good and impressive considering there's 2 other builds that can do the exact same thing. But I'm trying to get as much mileage out of this free set of gear, because if I do die in hardcore, I lose my gear, but I have another 2 sets of Marauders and another 2 sets of Unhallowed. But that means the free set of gear I got have really carried me quite a ways. So it's important to really try to get as much mileage out of some Marauders set as possible, in my opinion. And it's really good, and it's a fun build for me. I really enjoy the playstyle of it. But if you don't, then maybe try a different one. With all of that, if you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I also have a build-up on Diablo fans, which I will link in the comments, or rather in the description of the video. So anything I've said is all there, and so is a link to the video. But with that being said, I hope you the best with this build. It is really fun. It's likely to change over time based on different items being added, but for the most part, it should generally stay the same unless they change one of the set bonuses. So we shall see you guys next time.